Former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, we grieve with you and we grieve with your country's Jewish community after the demonic Hanukkah Massacre. So let's start here, my friend. How have you personally been processing what happened on Bondi Beach?
Well, it has been such an awful and terrible shock. It's a desecration of our nation. Australia is a peaceful country, and Bondi Beach is a place I grew up not too far from. It's a place of family, friends, sun, joy, happiness, all of these things. And in particular, it's quite a focus for the Jewish community here in Australia, and growing up near there with so many Jewish people. Just the horror of this has been extraordinarily hard to process, that it could happen in a place that so many people are so familiar with. So there's been a lot of processing. I took my family, Jenny and the girls. We went to the memorial site on the day after, just after that first 24 hours. We spent time with people there. We paid our respects. I've been spending quite a bit of time with the Jewish community again this week, which I've been doing for particularly the last few years, particularly post October 7. The Jewish community here in Australia has felt incredibly abandoned and isolated because of the policies of the government and the failure to take action on what has been rising anti-Semitism in this country. And just, my immediate response is just, look, we've just got to be there and comfort our Jewish brothers and sisters, and just let them know that they're not alone, and that we are with them. And the church community here in Australia has been doing that all along, particularly since October 7. And I know it's deeply appreciated by the Jewish community, and the evangelical community in particular.
Well, you mentioned anti-Semitism, and you were quoted saying, quote, that the Jewish community felt very alone in these last few years, very alone, very abandoned, very isolated, very forgotten. I guess the question is, why is that the case?
Well, the progressive sort of secularism that's sort of swamping Western societies had adopted a sort of an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel approach to go with their suite of issues that they have progressed globally, and that found its root here in Australia, and particularly on October 7, the great insult in all of this is when Israel suffered its worst attack and the worst assault against Jewish people since the Holocaust itself in that space of time. And it was not long before the sentiment and tide were turned against the Jewish community and support for Israel. I mean, when I left office after the election loss, Australia had reached the high point in our standing for Israel. We had reversed all of those, awful votes in the United Nations, where Israel is regularly demonized and attacked, and disproportionately to any other country in the world. We turned that around. We recognized the international anti-Semitism definition. We recognized West Jerusalem. We listed Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorist organizations, and stood very strongly with the people of Israel, the state of Israel, and Israel's allies, and particularly the United States. The new government took a complete reverse course on all of this. And unlike what has happened with the war in Ukraine, it's not like Australians have, or the Australian government for that matter, have targeted Russian Australians or people of that. They don't hold them responsible for what is occurring in Ukraine, and whether one have a very strong pro-Israel view on these things. But it's a democracy, and people will have different views about that. But to allow this tide of anti-Semitism to rise on the back of an anti-Israel, anti-Zionist position that was fostered by government and led to enabling a culture of anti-Semitism to breed. Of course, the Jewish community just felt just forgotten by their government. They saw them as being hostile to them, and wittingly or otherwise enabling those who were chanting the most heinous of slogans. I mean, 2 days after October 7, there was a protest on the steps of the Opera House where they chanted "Gas the Jews," and we've had firebombs of synagogues. We have had weekly protests. Our Harbour Bridge, people marched across that in large numbers. And there were signs of globalised the Intifada. There was pictures of the Ayatollah, all of this. And this was just an unrecognisable part of Australia, certainly the one that I had led and grown up in. And so, it has been a slow march of abandonment of the Jewish community in Australia. Now, they have had support, and most notably out of the church community here in Australia, and I know they're deeply grateful for that. But, we're also then targeted as repressive, colonialist, Zionists. It is quite an aggressive form of activism that has taken hold in our universities and in so many other places, and the government was just looked the other way. That's the kindest way I can put it. And I'm trying to be diplomatic.
Right. Well, I actually, my wife and I, we have two dear personal Jewish friends that we spent a lot of time with when we lived in New York, who are actually on Bondi Beach, and we've been texting with them on WhatsApp, and they just say their children are absolutely traumatized. Thank God they weren't hurt, but this is a deeply personal story to me as well. And I can feel your conviction and your sadness, and if I could just echo everything that you just said. But let me ask you this. If you look on social media, which is never a good idea, there's lots of who's to blame for this. And, I guess the three main avenues are immigration, just unfettered, unregulated immigration, however you want to call it, this culture of anti-Semitism. And then obviously the gun debate has been brought up now. And there's obviously a combination of those three. Now, obviously this just happened. We're still finding out details, and, we can't necessarily, you don't try the crime until, you have all the facts in order. But people want to know what to blame or what to fix. And if those are the three main things that you see, and maybe there's another one that I'm missing, what do you think fundamentally is to blame for allowing this to happen in Sydney?
Well, there is another one, and I'd rank it higher than most of the ones you just mentioned. The top one is anti-Semitism. There's no doubt about that. I said that the loaded gun that was present there on that day was anti-Semitism, and how it had been allowed to take hold and fester and grow in an enabling environment. Now, do I think the government did that deliberately or with intent? No, I don't. I think they did it through failing to appreciate the consequences of, seeking to change a 75-year-old policy, bipartisan policy in Australia that had refused to recognise a state of Palestine in the United Nations, unless it was part of the process of settlement of those issues that had long been the policy of most countries. And to break from that in the context of Israel being at war with terrorists in Hamas, and Hamas congratulated the Australian government for what it was doing. And there are others who did the same thing, France, etc., and the UK, who contributed to this. But Australia went along with that in its government, and that created a permissive environment for those who held anti-Semitic views to form the view that somehow things had changed, and there was an acceptance for their views, and there was a tolerance for their views. And when they weren't resisted, or when they weren't arrested, or when they weren't deported, they made assumptions, and it just kept getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And they saw a government that was at best apathetic around this. So anti-Semitism, number one, and strongly. And that's what has to be countered. And not just in our country, but in yours and in Europe and in Canada and many other places. And we must be eternally vigilant about that. The number of of anti-Semitic incidents that has occurred over the last 2 years has escalated more than tenfold since October 7th. Tenfold. Prior to October 7th, anti-Semitism is lurking always everywhere, but it was not where it has been the last few years. And I believe it is because it was able to flourish in an environment of enablement. The second one I'd say is radicalization. And I used to be the immigration minister in this country, and I was responsible for a thing called Operation Sovereign Borders, which achieved the protection of our borders when we had boats turning up, every day and thousands of people dying at sea. And we put an end to that through some very strong border protection policies. The reason I did that was because Australia is an immigration country, and if people don't have confidence in the strength of your borders, then how can they have confidence in the integrity of your immigration system? Equally, Australia has a very strong record of having good immigration controls. And when we lose sight of those rules and those controls and don't apply them, then that also leads to a lack of confidence in our immigration system. But in this case, the first of the elder of the two Islamic terrorists came to this country in 1998 on a student visa. There's no suggestion at all that at that time he held any of these types of views. He came from India. And even if you were to sort of use country rules as a way of limiting intakes, well, it wouldn't have been India that would have been targeted in something like that. And so he and his son were radicalized in Australia. And this is the truth with most terrorist incidents. The radicalization in where they take place in Western countries takes place in Western countries. Where the terrorist incident occurs, the individuals have been radicalized homegrown. And I think there's a very real issue about how Islamic faith is run and institutionalized in our Western countries. It's particularly true in Australia. If you go to any other religion or denominational faith, there is a strong institutional arrangement. There is a process of ordination. There is a process of recognition. There is a process of accountability, of standards, of training, of discipline, of all of these things, and a proactive culture of where people are teaching dangerous things, or pastors or priests or ministers, reverends, whatever, that if they believe that there are people in their flock that are being misled or being preyed upon by evil influences, they will take action. This is not occurring in Islam in Australia. It is too casual. It's too easy to set yourself up as an imam. And so while there are national imams councils, the affiliations are loose, the institutional structures are weak, and as a result, the Islamic faith needs to come to terms with what is occurring amongst its own community and needs to take stronger action itself, because we don't want governments to tell religions how they should operate and control them with laws and rules. I mean, I wouldn't want that applying to my faith, to my Christian faith in the evangelical church. Absolutely not. But ours has such disciplines and controls and so on. They're not perfect, but I can tell you they're leagues ahead of where it is in Islamic faiths. And that is where we have to realize there's hundreds of thousands of Muslim Australians, overwhelming majority, wonderful, patriotic Australians, but they are vulnerable in their faith communities to being preyed upon by evil teaching, which radicalizes people and takes them to these events. Now, on immigration, yes, you've got to get your intake right. You've got to get your composition right. You've got to be proactive about integration, not isolation. That's all very true. But I really want to emphasize this point about radicalization. We can sort of leap to the immigration solution, but I can tell you that won't solve the problem on its own. If you do not deal with the radicalization of cultures within your country and where they are vulnerable to these types of influences, you can do whatever you like on immigration, but those things will still happen. I mean, often terrorists are second generation, born and raised.
Well, I appreciate your moral clarity. I appreciate your courage to speak with candor. And I deeply appreciate the fact that you've made a career out of standing with the Jewish people. And so maybe let's close on this. I know you're a very, very busy man, which is this. A month after October 7th, you obviously visited Israel. This is a deeply personal subject to you, deeply spiritual, emotional. I mean, this is an issue that isn't really an issue. This is something that it's a part of your heart. So let's say you have the Jewish community in Australia watching this video, or the Jewish community here in California, or wherever it might be. But obviously, we're speaking to your audience in Australia. What do you want the Jewish community in Australia to know in this moment?
I want them to know that we love them. And I want them to know that we value them and their contribution to our country, and they are so important. And I want them to remain here. It breaks my heart that the country that was the safe haven for Holocaust survivors after the Second World War, and Australia was one of the prime places they came, that now the generations that follow are thinking of leaving Australia to go to Israel because they believe it will be safer than this country. And that just breaks my heart. I think the promise of Australia to the Australian Jewish community by our current government has been broken to them, and it needs to be restored. And I say remain, and let's work together to hold all of us to account to ensure that that promise is fulfilled again, and they can live here in peace and safety and know that they are deeply loved. And the best thing the church can do is love them, and they know it and they feel it. From our Christian community here in Australia, they have been the one that have stood with them the most, and they are deeply grateful. So keep loving.
Amen. That is a perfect answer. Former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, thank you so much for your time, my friend, and God bless.
Thank you. God bless you too.